Last time we discussed the first two acts in the play, which introduced the characters and set up the conflict. Act 3 picks up with a brief first scene in which Kent reveals to a servant that there is a secret conflict between the Dukes of Cornwall and Albany. Not only that, there's also an external threat in the form of French spies seeking to exploit England's domestic problems. In scene 2, the king and the fool struggle against the storm, the latter encouraging the king to seek shelter. King Lear displays an almost Stockholm Syndrome type of attitude towards the storm by declaring that nature owes him nothing and he is subject to its pleasure. Rumble, thy belly full. Spit fire, spout rain. Nor rain, wind, thunder, fire are my daughters. I tax not you, you elements, with unkindness. I never gave you kingdom, called you children. You owe me no subscription. Then let fall your horrible pleasure. Here I stand your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and despised old man. But yet I call you servile ministers, that have with two pernicious daughters joined your high-engendered battles against a head so old and white as this. Oh ho, 'tis foul. Kent finds the two and reveals that he knows of a nearby hovel in which they can take refuge from the storm. The fool delivers an interesting monologue here, and I really enjoy his way of describing a world that has been turned upside down. When priests are more in word than matter, when brewers mar their malt with water, when nobles are their tailors' tutors, no heretics burn but wenches suitors, when every case in law is right, no squire in debt, nor no poor knight, when slanders do not live in tongues, nor cut purses come not to throngs, when usurers tell their gold in the fields, when bawds and whores do churches build, then shall the realm of Albion come to great confusion. Then comes the time, who lives to seat, that going shall be used with feet. Scene 3 opens at Gloucester's castle with him mourning to Edmund that he has been forced to house the dukes against his will and not aid the king, being held prisoner in his own home to the wishes of others. He reaffirms to Edmund that not only are there domestic problems with the ousting of the king and the quarrel between Albany and Cornwall, but also that he has received a letter revealing that the French have landed an army in England. He states that he will try to help King Lear in secret against the wishes of the dukes. However, Gloucester is to be betrayed by his own son. Edmund contemplates to himself that he will betray his father and reveal the letter. He justifies his greed and remarks that, "This seems a fair deserving and must draw me, that which my father loses, no less than all, but younger rises when the old doth fall." In scene 4, King Lear, along with the fool and Kent, arrive outside of the hovel to seek shelter from the storm. While Kent complains about the severity of the storm, the king remarks how it is of little significance compared to the inner tempest of his mind that was caused by the filial impiety of his daughters. Interestingly, he also takes a moment to pity his own subjects, who live in poverty and must endure such nights on a consistent basis. He learns compassion from being put in their situation. Poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take psychic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what the wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. Inside of the hovel, they find Edgar, disguised as the naked madman named Tom. King Lear finds him fascinating and starts referring to him as a philosopher. Meanwhile, Gloucester finally finds the company and beseeches the king to go with him for shelter and food. It's interesting to realize here that Edgar, disguised as the Mad Tom, comes face to face with his father and must keep up the act. It's an important scene because it unites all the traditionally good characters of the play: Kent, Gloucester, Edgar, and King Lear. Though two of them are disguised, they all will eventually enter the hovel for sheltering. Meanwhile, at Gloucester's castle, Edmund enacts his evil plot and shows the letter regarding a French invasion that his father obtained to the Duke of Cornwall. The two of them declare Gloucester treasonous and arrange for his arrest. Edgar, disguised as Tom, Kent, Gloucester, and King Lear arrive at the castle but stop first at an adjoining farmhouse. Gloucester leaves to go gather some provisions but learns of the plot against the king and fears for his life. So he reports this to Kent and encourages him to be off at once towards Dover with the king to escape the persecution. Gloucester is brought before the Duke of Cornwall and Regan, where they plan revenge against him. Some of the servants tie the victim to a chair within his own home, and Regan begins to torture him by plucking out one of Gloucester's beard hairs. And although certainly not meant to be comedic, I can't help but laugh at his response. "By the kind gods, 'tis most ignobly done to pluck me by the beard." It only gets worse from there when Cornwall gouges out one of his host's eyes. A nearby servant stands up for Gloucester and exclaims to Cornwall, "Hold your hand, my lord. I have served you ever since I was a child, but better service have I never done you than now to bid you hold." One thing to consider is that Shakespeare did draw a lot of inspiration from Hellenic culture, particularly the writings of Aristotle. In ancient Greece, two things were considered among the worst offenses imaginable. First, filial impiety. Second was hospitality. Hospitality was considered a sacred duty and even a way to honor the gods. So far in King Lear, the main plot revolves around filial impiety through the actions of Goneril, Regan, and also Edmund against their respective fathers. In this scene, we see a defiling of hospitality. The Earl of Gloucester has opened his home to the Duke of Cornwall and now finds himself being tortured by his guest within his own home. These sinful actions certainly bore more weight in the 17th century than we may realize. Cornwall does not take lightly to his servant confronting him, and the two draw swords. Cornwall is significantly wounded, but Regan stabs the servant from behind, killing him. Cornwall goes on to pluck out Gloucester's second eyeball, and I find the servant's character very interesting. He's an otherwise nobody in the background who is unceremoniously named as Servant 1 in the play. Yet out of all the characters, it is this nobody who musters the courage to do something brave and stand up to the undue cruelty. Sure, you can argue that Kent, Edgar, and Cordelia are also righteous and brave in their own regard, but it's Servant 1 who draws his sword to stand up to what he believes is right without going into exile or disguising himself. He stands up right then and there, paying the ultimate price. Gloucester weeps at his misfortune and pain, and Regan informs him that it was his son Edmund that betrayed him. The irony clearly is that now blind, he finally sees the treachery where he could not before. And that concludes Act 3. Act 4 opens with an old man leading the blind Gloucester until they coincidentally come across Edgar, still playing the part of Mad Tom. Edgar is overcome with grief seeing his father blind and suffering, but is still forced to feign ignorance. Gloucester insists that the old man leave him so that Tom can be his new guide and remarks that "'Tis the time's plague when madmen lead the blind." He then commands Tom to lead him to the precipice of a tall cliff overlooking Dover, implying an intent to kill himself. In Scene 2, Goneril and Edmund arrive outside of the Duke of Albany's castle and are met by Oswald. He informs them that upon hearing of their recent events, the Duke has become upset and has taken the side of Gloucester and Edgar, condemning the actions of Cornwall, Regan, and Goneril. Indignant, Goneril declines her husband's status as a man and confesses that her love lies with Edmund. She kisses him and bids that he return to Cornwall to avoid the wrath of Albany. The Duke then enters the scene and scolds his unfaithful wife. They are interrupted by a messenger who brings news that the Duke of Cornwall has succumbed to his wounds sustained while fighting the servant. Goneril expresses some delight, seeing that obtaining power will be easier with Cornwall gone, but also jealousy, knowing that Edmund is returning to a freshly widowed Regan. The scene concludes with Albany swearing to avenge Gloucester. In a battle camp near Dover, a messenger tells Kent that the King of France had to urgently return to his home country but left one of his generals and Cordelia in command. The messenger was able to meet with Cordelia and inform her of everything that has happened. He watched her overcome with emotion and compassion for her father. However, King Lear is so overcome with regret regarding his actions that he is ashamed to meet with Cordelia. Kent asks the messenger to try and convince the king otherwise. The next scene opens with Cordelia mourning the maddened state of King Lear, and she sends out a party of 100 men to search for him. She also learns that the British armies are marching towards them, though the French are prepared for an engagement. Meanwhile, back at Gloucester's castle, Oswald arrives and informs Regan of Albany's new attitudes and that he must deliver a letter from Goneril to Edmund. Also consumed by jealousy, Regan writes her own letter to Edmund and asks Oswald to deliver it also. She regrets not killing Gloucester while she had the opportunity, since it seems like he's turning people's opinions against her. This brief scene fully reveals the jealous love triangle between the two sisters and Edmund. Near Dover, Mad Tom continues to lead Gloucester to the peak of a tall cliff, or at least that's what Gloucester thinks. Edgar instead takes him to an insignificant spot and takes advantage of his father's blindness to describe how they are atop of a dreadfully tall peak. It's all an act though. Gloucester kneels down and speaks his last words before falling forward to what he assumes to be the precipice of his death, but is instead just some flat ground. It's not explicitly stated, but it can be inferred that Gloucester either loses consciousness, perhaps from shock, or perhaps from hitting his head on the ground. But moments later, Edgar rushes up to him, disguising his voice and acting as a passerby. He tells Gloucester that he just saw him plunge from a tall cliff and miraculously survived the fall. Gloucester buys the story and becomes convinced that Mad Tom, who led him to the precipice, was a devil. He has a renewed will to live, which is very interesting. King Lear enters the scene clearly descended into madness and dressed outlandishly with flowers. He rants on several topics, but seems mainly interested on the topic of justice and the hypocrisy in such an exercise. He remarks, "Why dost thou lash that whore? Strip thine own back. Thou hotly lust to use her in that kind for which thou whippest her. The usurer hangs the cozener. Through tattered clothes small vices do appear. Robes and furred gowns hide all. Plate sin with gold, and the strong lance of justice hurtless breaks. Armed in rags, a pygmy straw does pierce it. None does offend. None, I say, none. I'll able 'em. Take that of me, my friend, who have the power to seal the accuser's lips. Get thee glass eyes, and like the scurvy politician, seem to see things that thou dost not. Now. Pull off my boots. Harder so." This is perhaps another biblical reference, this time to John chapter 8 verse 7, in which an adulteress is brought before Jesus and he says, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." The king and Gloucester recognize each other, and some attendants enter the scene hoping to escort Lear to Cordelia, but he runs off wildly like a crazy man. Oswald is next to enter the scene, intent on killing Gloucester for a bounty, but Edgar intervenes and kills him instead. He discovers the letter from Goneril to Edmund, describing her wish that Albany would die so that she can become Edmund's wife. Scene 7 opens with the king asleep inside of a French tent. Cordelia, Kent, and a doctor enter. Although confused, Lear recognizes his daughter and begins to come to his senses. He tells Cordelia, "But your tears wet? Yes, Faith, I pray, weep not. If you have poison for me, I will drink it. I know you do not love me, for your sisters have, as I do remember, done me wrong. You have some cause, they have not." He recognizes that he has wronged Cordelia and judges himself to need punishment, but Cordelia instead offers joy at his recovery and full forgiveness. The final act of the play opens in the British camp near Dover with Edmund and Regan. The former is interested in knowing whether Albany will assist them in battle, while the latter is much more preoccupied if Edmund has slept with her sister or not. Albany and Goneril arrive and the group disperses after a brief conversation. Edgar, disguised as a peasant, gives the letter that he has been carrying to Albany, the letter that alludes to the affair between Goneril and Edmund. The scene closes with Edmund self-reflecting. "To both these sisters have I sworn my love, each jealous of the other as the stung are to the adder. Which of them shall I take? Both? One? Or neither? Neither can be enjoyed if both remain alive. To take the widow exasperates, makes mad her sister Goneril, and hardly shall I carry out my side, her husband being alive. Now then, we'll use his countenance for the battle, which being done, let her who would be rid of him devise his speedy taking off. As for his mercy, which he intends to Lear and to Cordelia, the battle done, and they within our power, shall never see his pardon, for my state stands on me to defend, not to debate." He begins to see how his web of lies is dangerously close to collapsing and adjusts his strategy, planning to use Albany for the battle and later have him, Cordelia, and King Lear killed, along with one of the sisters, which to him does not matter which of the two it is. Scene 2 is extremely brief. In it, Edgar leaves his blind father Gloucester underneath a tree and vows to return once the battle has finished. After some brief stage movement, he returns to inform Gloucester that the battle is lost, and that King Lear and Cordelia have been taken captive. The triumphant Edmund parades his prisoners and tells his guards to take them away to prison. Cordelia remarks, "We are not the first, who with the best meaning have incurred the worst. For thee, oppressed king, I am cast down. Myself could else outfrown false fortune's frown." But her father tries to lift her spirits and suggests that they can make good of their situation. "No, no, no, no. Come, let's away to prison. We'll two alone sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news, and we'll talk with them too. Who loses and who wins, who's in, who's out, and take upon the mystery of things, as if we were God's spies. And we'll wear out, in a walled prison, packs and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon." Edmund then sends a captain to follow after the captives being taken to prison with a letter, and this is presumed to be instructions to kill them based on his self-dialogue in Scene 1. Albany, Goneril, and Regan enter the scene, and Albany reestablishes his position as the leader and declares that Edmund is his subordinate who had no right to send the captives away. Regan and Goneril defend Edmund, but Regan is forced to leave after she starts feeling sick. Albany declares that Edmund is a traitor, and a herald blows a horn 3 times to summon anyone willing to prove Edmund's treachery. Edgar enters the scene disguised as a noble soldier and mortally wounds his evil brother. Goneril cries out, but is silenced by Albany, who shows her the adulterous letter that she wrote to Edmund. Overwhelmed, she too leaves the scene, and the victorious soldier reveals himself as Edgar and recounts all of his deeds, but also revealing that once he told his father who he really was, Gloucester's heart, torn between grief and joy, gave out and he died. An attendant then storms into the scene and reveals that Goneril has killed herself, and the reason Regan was feeling sick earlier was because Goneril had poisoned her, and now both sisters are dead. Kent also enters the scene. Edmund recognizes that he is about to die, but does go through a small redemption arc after seeing the error of his ways. He says about Goneril and Regan, "I was contracted to them both, all 3 now marry in an instant," which I think is a very cool way of describing his inevitable death. He goes on to reveal that he ordered the death of King Lear and Cordelia and urges an attendant to take his sword as a token and rush to the captain that he sent out earlier to prevent the executions from occurring. He then dies from his mortal wound. It's too late, however. King Lear enters the scene carrying the dead Cordelia in his arms. He reveals that he skewered the man who hanged her with his own sword. Tragically, he maintains some false hope that his daughter may still be alive and holds a feather to her lips. This feather stirs. She lives. If it be so, it is a chance which does redeem all sorrows that ever I have felt. Kent reveals himself and is recognized by the king, who again expresses some of that false hope in his final words. "And my poor fool is hanged. No, no, no life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou'lt come no more, never. Never, 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 never. Pray you undo this button. Thank you, sir. Do you see this? Look on her. Look. Her lips. Look there. Look there. Fool here is meant as an endearing term for Cordelia, and the king dies after uttering these words. Quite a tragic way to die, surrounded by his 3 dead daughters and looking at the lips of his fondest, imagining some sign of life. Kent discourages anyone from trying any sort of resuscitation by declaring, "Vex not his ghost. Oh, let him pass. He hates him that would upon the rack of this tough world stretch him out longer." Albany states that the righteous Kent and Edgar should rule the kingdom, but both foreshadow more tragedy in their future. And the play finally concludes with a death march as the characters exit. And that concludes the play. Now, for me to discuss and analyze this, I must warn you that I'll be doing so in a very genuine and organic sort of way. That is to say, I want to briefly discuss how I interpreted the play and what I got out of it. Shakespeare inevitably ends up being a very academic thing since it's required reading for most high school and college literature, so there seems to be like a right and wrong way to interpret it, if you will. People like to discuss Shakespeare with a somewhat disingenuous academic tone, which is more concerned with proper literary analysis instead of a creative discussion. So, yeah, I could sit here and talk about how King Lear displays hubris, ego, and dangerous pride and slowly descends into madness, and how the storm in Scene 3 is deep symbolism about the king's inner turmoil, so on and so forth. But instead, I want to discuss a few things that I think fall outside of the general convention of what is accepted as the proper analysis of this play. First of all, and I mentioned this bit in the last episode, it's assumed that King Lear is an egocentric fool with little to no wisdom in the very first scene of the play, and that these character traits set up his arc as a fall from grace. However, I don't think that's the case at all. Recall that in the very first dialogue of the play between Gloucester and Kent, they're discussing how the king has split up the kingdom. So that implies that the king put a lot of thought into it and had already made a decision regardless of the daughter's speeches. So the king is also very old, and things seem to be pretty well initially, so this suggests that he had a long and successful tenure as a ruler, and I would argue that when he asked his daughters to indulge him with speeches of love, he did more so to satisfy his needs as a father and to reaffirm that he has loving daughters instead of using it as the basis for dividing the kingdom. And with this in mind, and knowing that the king collapses into madness thereafter, I think that a much more meaningful theme emerges. That is, at the end of his life and career, Lear seems to be more concerned about the love of his daughters than he does with the administration of the kingdom. It tries to communicate a lesson that, in the end, family is what matters most. Realizing that he has left his kingdom in order, but does not have Cordelia's affection, the king despairs and perhaps feels like his time and efforts were misplaced. This is further emphasized in the final scene before he's taken to prison, in which he states how happy he and Cordelia can still be enjoying each other's company behind bars. By this point, he has given up all cares regarding his kingdom and well-being and cares only about spending time with his daughter. Now, of course, though, he is foolish for not seeing through Regan and Goneril's fakeness and failing to recognize Cordelia's love in the beginning of the play. That's pretty much given. Now, reading through Scene 1 the first time around, it's clearly apparent that Goneril and Regan are nasty and evil while Cordelia is righteous. In fact, in the previous video where I discussed the scene, I said that there is a clear dichotomy established already between Cordelia and her sisters. In the one, there's sincerity, honor, and wisdom, while in the others, there's deceit, greed, and opportunism. Cordelia is clearly set up as an honorable and virtuous character throughout the play, returning in Act 5 to try and save her father from the injustices done in her absence. However, after reading the entire play, a second reading of the first scene provides a totally new interpretation, at least for me. I would argue that Cordelia is indeed a villain, even if unintentionally. Think about it. If it were not for Cordelia, the entire tragedy would have been averted. No one would have died, a war with France would have been averted, and the kingdom would have been way better off. Cordelia clearly loves her father very genuinely and expresses so in an aside during the first scene. However, she is way too proud to profess it in a bombastic speech like her sisters as requested by the king. So it's her pride and arrogant self-righteousness that sparks the entire tragedy. If she had only put her love into poetic words and played along with the king, the kingdom would have been fairly divided and she could have countered any evil plots of her sisters from within. So I would argue that although Cordelia is painted as the only one with sense and wisdom, the exact opposite is true. What did her righteousness get her in the end? She's truly the biggest fool from which all of the evils were allowed to grow. I think that this is an important lesson overall. Sometimes, if you are surrounded by evil, trying to be the one light of righteousness just for the sake of being right will be counterproductive and probably destructive. Being pragmatic is extremely important. Again, what did being righteous get Cordelia? Imagine what she could have accomplished instead had she played along and implemented better strategy. This what if is actually self-evident in the play itself. Look at the cases of Edgar and Kent. They too seemingly stood alone against evil, Instead of making themselves a target of that evil so they could feel self-righteous about it, they fought against it with strategy and intent. They disguised themselves and worked tirelessly throughout the play to right the wrongs, and in the end, they were the most effective and powerful characters of all, in my opinion. I think it's easy to point out such characters as cowardly for not standing tall against treachery, but I suggest the exact opposite. It was easier for Cordelia to claim moral superiority over everyone and to disappear to France while evil consumed Britain than it would have been for her to stay and actually do something about it. I'm certainly not suggesting that Goneril, Regan, Oswald, Albany, or Cornwall were better characters, but I ask again, would any of this have happened if Cordelia didn't selfishly take the high ground? Cordelia's self-righteous pride is the ultimate villain of the play. Overall, I did find this to be an enjoyable read. It's short but packs in a lot of meaningful themes such as loyalty, filial piety, aging, and sin. In Loyalty, we see the characters who sacrificed for its sake ultimately become the true winners, Kent and Edgar. In Aging, we see a king, at the end of a seemingly successful reign, wither and crumble into a disrespected beggar as his life's work falls apart before him. His character arc truly shows the transient nature of life, how quickly things change, and how the old generation is swept aside. In Filial Piety and Sin, we see how the latter corrupts the former. The greed of Goneril and Regan is used as a weapon against their own father, leaving a trail of blood. Their lust for Edmund sees them turn on each other and ultimately kills them both. The Fool is a wonderful character that helps to highlight some of these lessons with really interesting and poetic passages from a seemingly omniscient point of view. So for these book clubs, I do want to end them by giving my rating of the book. My scale will be from 0 to 10, and here's a brief visual representation of it. 0 means absolute garbage, and if you hear the book being discussed, it's your moral obligation to butt in and trash it. 10 can't mean perfect, or else I will never be able to give a 10, so I'll make a 10 be a vague and subjective, one of the best things I've ever read in my life. 5 is a barely passing score, meaning I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I'm glad I read it. 7 is good, 8 or 9 is great, so that's the scale. Now before I rate King Lear, I do want to cushion it a little bit because Shakespeare is meant to be observed as plays, not written as stories. If you watch a performance of King Lear, which there are many of these on YouTube, it's a completely different experience and totally elevates it. Just reading the play, I did not find it very compelling, but after watching a performance, I definitely understand the appeal. The other thing to note is that Shakespearean plays are meant to be very simple. No crazy effects or budget, there was no scenery or backdrops, props were extremely simple, important details were often woven into the spoken dialogue itself instead of being acted out, so it's important to keep those limitations in mind. And at the end of the day, I give it a 6. Now I know, I'm gonna get crucified for that. How dare you give a Shakespearean masterpiece only a 6? I get it. I know I'm probably underrating it compared to what others think, but it's my goal to be as genuine as possible with my personal reviews and not rate something based on how the rest of the world views it. There were spectacular passages, which I quoted often during this book club, but overall, a lot of things felt a little lazy to me. I love tragedies, and I love the themes that the play explored, but I do think that there are better and more creative ways to explore them. When I say that certain things felt lazy, I'm talking about several things. Number 1, I think that there was an over-reliance on the letters to move the plot forward. It seems like every major plot twist was revealed through a letter. I could go off and say how the letters are actually some deep symbolic thing or whatever, but to me, it seems a little forced. I think that information could have been revealed in more interesting and unique ways. The second thing that I found sloppy was Gloucester's attempted suicide. The fact that he just plops down on flat ground and is convinced that he fell from a giant cliff seemed unintentionally and comically bad for me. Again, I understand the limitations of a stage play, but surely there was a better way to do this. And finally, people are just dying left and right of shock. Gloucester and Lear both just suddenly die from grief. That too felt a little lazy to me. Otherwise, I am glad to have read this. I think Shakespeare is something that will take time to grow on me, and I do intend on going through all of Shakespeare eventually. I would imagine my appreciation grows over time, but for now, that's all I have. Be sure to join the book club channel on my Discord server. We discuss whatever book I'm making a video on next, and I plan to incorporate our discussions into the videos as well. So that's it for now. See ya.